think it's safe to say that most people know that if you are married or if you get married to somebody, then you can sponsor them to come to Canada as your spouse or your partner. And probably if you have children. But can you bring your aunt or your uncle, your parents, your grandparents, your cousins to Canada? Today, we're going to explore the family sponsorship program or the family sponsorship opportunities that are available as a Canadian immigration program. Hi, I am Christina. I am a 10-year Canadian immigrant. I have come to Canada as an international student and I became a citizen after 5 years. And I have been through almost every application process, student, postgraduate work permit, permanent residency through express entry, citizenship. I have done spousal sponsorship application for myself as well. And probably the list kind of goes on in terms of my involvement in any kind of application. So welcome to As Told by Canadian Immigrants. Please stick around and consider subscribing for more helpful videos like this. So first of all, when it comes to sponsoring your family member, the first eligibility depends on you. Are you able to sponsor the person that you want to sponsor? That's the first check mark out the gate. You have to be at least 18 years old. You have to be either a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. When I sponsored my spouse, I was a permanent resident. I wasn't even a citizen at the time when I applied. You have to be, or a person registered in Canada as an Indian under the Canadian Indian Act. Now, having that status is kind of step one, but you also have to be living in Canada. If not living in Canada right now, when you are submitting an interest, at least when the person is approved to come to Canada as a permanent resident, you have to be living in Canada at that time. Now, application processes can vary. I'm going to show you how to check the processing times because it depends on where you're applying from and where you're applying to, and inside Quebec, outside Quebec, blah, blah, blah. When I did it, the processing time was exactly 1 year, 12 months, actually 13 months. So the next thing is that you have to show that you can financially support whoever it is that you are sponsoring. And you have to show that you are not on social assistance outside of being on disability assistance. Disability is okay, but any other kind of financial assistance does not make you eligible. So this is you, the person who is in Canada, interested in sponsoring somebody. Your eligibility. Then we're talking about who now is a family member. An interesting story. My mother was denied entry into Canada after she landed in Canada during the 2020 COVID pandemic. I say 2020 because it was during 2020 that happened, not 2019. And when she landed in Canada, only immediate family members of Canadian permanent residents or citizens were allowed to enter because she landed on the day they closed the border. And on that day, I learned that I am my mother's immediate family member, but she is not my immediate family member. No. So your child is your immediate family member. I am my mother's child, but your mother is not your immediate family member because my immediate family member is my spouse and child, according to Canada. Anyways, I don't know how that works, but that was the definition. Then they changed it afterwards. So you have to get really clear on who is a family member. So your spouse, your common law partner, your conjugal partner, your dependent children, orphaned brother or sister can be considered a family member, brother or sister. Your niece or nephew, orphaned niece or nephew, orphaned grandchild, your parents, your grandparents, and at least one relative. So only one, you can only choose one in your entire life. One relative who is related by blood or adoption who is of any age. Now, there's a big thing that you must always know in immigration in general, but with this specifically, conditions apply. Okay? So we're going to go through each of these family members and then determine what are the conditions and how is it possible. Now, I think the spousal application or the spousal family relationship and the child are the most straightforward and easiest to prove, right? So your spouse is somebody that you are legally married to, and for Canadian immigration purposes has to be at least 18 years or older. So you can sponsor your spouse. You would have to prove that you are actually legally married, prove that it's a legitimate relationship. So just a marriage certificate is not enough. You have to show legitimacy of the relationship. You have to show pictures together or emails that go back certain times. When I did the spousal sponsorship application, that's the only Canadian immigration application that I did not do on my own. I was not interested in trying to go through that on my own because you have to provide a lot of backup, and my application was like this thick in terms of papers. Okay. You have to show emails going back for however long. You have to show pictures just to prove that it is a legitimate relationship and it's not just getting married for the sake of papers. Once you're able to prove that this is your spouse, you are financially able to support your spouse because he or she will be your dependent for the next 3 years, or your financial responsibility for the next 3 years after they become a permanent resident. It is pretty straightforward in the sense that, okay, provide all the information that you need to provide. It takes 1 year to process. They do their landing, they come to Canada. Now, there is a policy in place for spouses who live with their partners in Canada. I don't know how you live with your partner in Canada without valid status. But if you live in Canada with your partner, and your application is in, you can apply for a work permit to work, for your spouse to work while the application is being processed, because this processing time can be at least a year. So the spouse can be in Canada working. Now, if your spouse is outside of Canada, living outside of Canada, that is not an allowance that they have made that I can see. But once it is approved, the application is approved, they can come to Canada and they are landed permanent residents. They don't have to do anything else apart from show up. Probably the most guaranteed way to get Canadian permanent residency. All right. So that is the spouse. Now your common law partner. So your common law partner is like your spouse, except you're not legally married. So you can't prove that you are legally married, right? So you're not legally married, at least 18 years or older, can prove that you have been living together for at least 1 year, which is 12 consecutive months, and any time that is spent apart must be short or temporary. If one of you is unsure about the relationship or chooses to end the relationship, then they consider the relationship to be null and void, and therefore you're not common law partners anymore. Once you're able to prove that, the application process and all the things that you have to provide and support is similar to the spouse. You have to show that it's a legitimate relationship, how far back it went, prove that you're living together and stuff. These kind of things, I think, are best guided by an immigration consultant, because they will know how to make things communicate clearly on paper on your application, so that there's no question about the legitimacy of your relationship, especially as common law. And then there is conjugal. So conjugal is kind of like common law / married, but you're living apart, usually in separate countries. You're separated by borders and you're unable to get married because of some extenuating circumstance. So you can't get married and you can't live together. So maybe it's that you are abroad in another country, you have been denied entry to Canada or something, or you can't get a visa or something is blocking you from getting married. And so you are together at least for a year, living apart, and can prove that there is a legitimate relationship. This one is a little bit more complicated, I think, because you're going to need to prove that you are living in another country for a reason that you could not overcome, and you're going to need to prove that you couldn't get married. So there's rules around types of marriage, because any one of these relationships can be same sex or different sex. So there's different rules in different countries about different things. That one is a little bit more complicated than marriage or common law. But if you know that this is you, then I'm sure that you can provide the paperwork and again, get help. This is one of the applications I did not want to take on by myself. Not dependent children. So this is very interesting, because in most countries, a dependent child or children is usually up to the age of 18. I think they've since changed this in Canada, and now a dependent child/children is anybody under the age of 22. So your child can still be sponsored by you, who is the parent, if they're 22 years or younger. They also cannot have a spouse or common law partner, so they're just a single individual who is less than 22 years old. Now, there are special considerations for children who are older than 22. So if their child is older than 22 and they cannot financially support themselves because of a physical or mental disability, then they can be sponsored, and they have shown, or you can show that they have been dependent on you for all this time and up to 22 and after. So if they're dependent on you in that way, financially and probably physically because of some physical or mental condition, then special conditions apply. They'll think about you. They'll be nice to you in Canada. So these ones are the more straightforward kind of relationships that you can prove and that are your immediate family members. So now here comes the less typical one. Here's a less typical one, but probably not so hard to prove as well, is an orphaned brother, sister, niece, nephew, or grandchild. An orphan, both their parents have passed. Check. They have to be related to you by blood or adoption. They are under the age of 18 and they are single and not married. So similar to the dependent child sort of application. Of course, if they're not an orphan, it won't work. So if one of their parents is alive, it won't work. You also have to be able to prove that both their parents have passed away. So if it's a case where you just don't know where their parents are, it won't work. They have to be legally classified as orphans because their parents have passed away, not abandoned because their parents are nowhere to be found. So that's kind of different, right? And an orphan is not somebody whose parents are in prison or anything like that. So their parents have to have passed. These are the conditions under which you can sponsor an orphan brother, sister, niece, or nephew. And that's the actual application process becomes a little bit more straightforward once you can properly define what the relationship is to you. So if they're an orphan brother or sister, check, then the application kind of just needs to be put together. So the best thing that you want to do is to be able to properly define, okay, is this common law? Is this conjugal? Is this spouse? Is this my dependent? And then from there on, you kind of just get the application done. And every application, most applications are going to be dependent on your special circumstance, your special relationship, the length of your relationship, the country that you're in. There's different things. And so there's no one size fits all necessarily, but it is a straightforward process in terms of the typical things that you need to provide and then whatever is special about you. And these ones, I suggest getting help. I do. Now, a lot of people know about the parent and grandparent sponsorship program, right? So this year they did it very interestingly. They said, we are going to open up the parent and grandparent sponsorship program for 2023. And we're only going to take the people who submitted an interest to sponsor 3 years ago in 2020. So if you submitted an interest to sponsor in 2020, you were in the pool that they were picking from for the 2023 intake of parent and grandparent. I was in that pool. I did not get an email. Okay. They opened it up between October 10th and the 24th, I believe. And they were just going to pick from the 2020 applicants. I didn't get picked. And we know that parent and grandparent, there is a lottery system sort of to it. You sort of enter, you buy a ticket, and if they pick your numbers, yay you. Now, I found that the parent and grandparent sponsorship program got very specific with the proof of funds, because the proof of funds for parent and grandparent sponsorship was tied to your tax return. So it's not about how much money you have in the bank today. It is how much money have you shown that you have been earning for the last 3 years leading up to when you are applying for interest or submitting an interest to sponsor. So that sort of changes things, especially for people who were affected by the pandemic. Their income was affected by the pandemic. They did lower the levels a little bit, but it depends on how big you were hit by the pandemic. Were you just put on less hours, or were you outright out of a job right? So all these things kind of came into play, and I went on maternity leave during that time, and my family size increased because, of course, I just had a kid. So the proof of funds generally with any of these programs has to do with anybody and everybody that is dependent on you, plus whoever you are interested in sponsoring. Okay. So that was Parent and Grandparent for 2023. Obviously, we can't say this is what it's going to be from now on because we really don't know. We're going to see how things unfold in 2024 for this program. But for now, it's a lottery program, a lottery system. And if you buy a ticket 3 years ago, you stood a chance to win. If you didn't, good luck next year. If they don't, next year, they don't revert to the people who submitted in 2023. May the odds be ever in your favor. Now, this one I think is the most taboo or the most easily misunderstood one, because you'd think that, okay, you know what? I have a brother or a sister. Can I sponsor them to come to Canada? Maybe. That's the answer. Maybe. You can sponsor one other relative in your entire lifetime. Just one other relative that is related to you by blood or by adoption that is any age, if you, the sponsor, don't have a living relative that you can sponsor instead. So you can't have a spouse that is not yet with you in Canada. Common law partner, conjugal partner, parent, grandparent, orphaned brother, sister, orphaned niece or nephew, orphaned grandchild. You have to go through all of those relationships first. And if none of these exist, then you can go and sponsor your auntie or your uncle or whoever else is related to you by blood or adoption of any age. Then, criteria number 2 is that the person who is trying to sponsor somebody, after passing through all those family members, you also cannot have a relative that is a Canadian citizen, a Canadian permanent resident, or a person registered under the Indian Act. So you, the potential sponsor, don't have any relatives, aunt or uncle, or any of the list above who is a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. I obviously don't qualify because my parents, I can't sponsor my sister, for example. So here's a live example, right? I can't sponsor my sister because I have both my parents who are living, who are not permanent residents or citizens of Canada, who I can sponsor instead. That's criteria number 1 that makes me ineligible to sponsor my sister, or my sister an ineligible person to sponsor. The next thing for me is that I have an aunt in Canada. So I have a relative in Canada who is a Canadian citizen. So that's my second thing. That's red flag. I cannot sponsor another relative or some other relative related to me by blood or something because I have a relative in Canada and probably other relatives that I don't really know about. But very specific situation that is not necessarily the easiest to prove. But if you are in Canada, you have no spouse, no children, no parents, no grandparents, no orphaned relatives, then, and you have no relatives living in Canada, then you can sponsor. And I'm thinking about you, Barb, who asked a question about being able to sponsor your sister to come to Canada because your parents are first in line for the throne. Your parents are first in line for being sponsored to come to Canada before you even get to your sister. So if you have parents that are living, they are in line first and you can't skip past them and get to your sister, even if they don't want to come to Canada. Nice and complicated, right? Here's how you check your processing time. So for the family sponsorship, you are sponsoring a spouse who is living outside of Canada, who is living inside of Canada, child. So let's say spouse, where in Canada will you be living? Outside of Quebec. Get processing times, 13 months. And so, everything is going to be different based on the type of application. Let's say child, where do you live? Let's say you live in the child live. Where does the child live in Jamaica? Processing time, 13 months. There you go. In a nutshell, those are the criteria for which you can sponsor a relative to come to Canada and live with you in Canada as a citizen or a permanent resident. The most straightforward one, spouse and children, and then common law conjugal, and even orphans. When it comes to trying to sponsor other family members, it's not so simple. It's not so easy. I cannot sponsor my sister even if I wanted to right now, or even if she was interested in it. So it just doesn't work for me, and doesn't work for a lot of people. It has been a pleasure sharing with you guys as always. If this video was helpful to you, please hit the like button, hit the thumbs up. Share this video with anybody who you think it will be helpful for. I appreciate you for watching this video. Stay tuned. This is part of our All Canadian Immigration Programs from A to Z. This was Family Sponsorship, letter F. And next we're going to talk about the Francophone Mobility Program. So stay tuned. These videos come out on a Monday or a Tuesday until we get to Z. And then we will move on from the Canadian immigration programs. But what I did find about Canadian immigration, it is like a rabbit hole that you go down and down and down. And the further you go, the deeper it gets, and it never ever ends. New programs are opening up, new opportunities are opening up. And if Canada is for you, then try it out. If it is not, because it is not for everybody, don't try it out. I appreciate you. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.